Before I was born, my grandparents were considering what I'd call them. And for himself, my grandfather, who never lacked in self-confidence, chose Grand. So that's what I called him for all of my life. I called him Grand. And that's just what he was to me, the grandest grandfather a boy could ask for. And speaking about Grand feels odd to me because I was a fixture in so many of his speeches. And often he'd begin with what he called a Jack story. Some of these stories were true, many were not. But I was honored just the same. He's the first person I can remember watching deliver a speech, and he commanded an audience, but in a gentle sort of way. He struck this balance between power and a kind of humble intimacy. It felt like a genuine conversation. I couldn't always understand his message when I was younger, but I watched the faces of his listeners. They were enraptured. And then in the middle of a speech on civil rights or ethics in journalism, he'd point me out. He'd tell them what musical I'd been cast in or what kind of drive I'd hit yesterday on the third hole. I'd turn red with embarrassment, but being mentioned made me beam with pride. No matter what age I was, he never really treated me like a kid. It's a rare thing to be able to call somebody 70 years older than you a friend, but he was. He never felt old to me. I knew he'd seen the world twice over, but he had a talent for taking you where he'd been. He was a master storyteller. Some of the happiest memories I have of my childhood revolve around his stories. When I was 8 or 9 and he was visiting, I'd make sure he was the one tucking me in at bedtime, and I'd always ask for a story. So he'd crawl under the covers with me and start with one, a story about his brother Connie pretending to hold up a gas station, or the Tennessean infiltration of the Ku Klux Klan. I'd ask for another, and then another, and soon Grand Dolores would be in the room, scolding him for keeping me up long past my bedtime. His stories resonated more and more as I grew older. I'd tell him what I was learning in history class, and he'd bring it to life. When we learned about the Russian Revolution, he told me how ousted President Kerensky had sat in his dining room. When we talked about Jimmy Hoffa, Grand explained how he testified in court against the mobster. And when we reached the Kennedy years, well, no textbook could rival the intimacy Grand shared with Robert Kennedy and his family. As impressive as his first-hand encounters with history were, the breadth of his knowledge of the history before his time was even more striking. He was a model for self-education and the most well-read man I've ever met. He loved Shakespeare and he could quote from it readily. In the last weeks of life, he was still reciting entire scenes from Hamlet and the Henrys. Despite his literacy and his experience, he was never arrogant. He was never haughty. He listened, and he listened indiscriminately. He had a clever mischief in him, and he wasn't afraid to involve me in some of his scheming. I remember going into the office at the First Amendment Center one day when I was 13. He asked me to sit in on a meeting with Keel Hunt and Hal Hardin. He said, "I don't know what the hell it's about, but we'll find out in the meeting." So they came in and sat down, and Mr. Hunt said, "John, you know what we're here for. You know what we're about." And he said, "Of course I do. Of course I do. But why don't you tell my grandson Jack exactly why you're here?" Of course, he didn't remain aloof for long. He ended up writing the foreword for Mr. Hunt's book. When he took a genuine interest in something, he would commit to it with everything he had to give. In the last few days, I've pored over some of Grand's writings. You all know him as the journalist, but his written works extend far beyond reporting. Poems, song lyrics, short stories, 4 published books, others near completion. He was hundreds of pages through a biography of suffragette leader Alice Paul. He was working on it within weeks of his death. For me, however, the most valuable writing I found were letters he had written, addressed Dear Jack. Some I had seen, some I had not, penned before I could understand or appreciate them. They blend his needling humor with his sweet, generous brand of love that I experienced again and again. One letter chronicling my visit to Nashville at age 5 reads, After dinner, you and I played chess. We agreed that you would get to beat me twice and that I would try to win the third. But after a long game and some controversy, we declared a stalemate and both congratulated each other on wonderful games. Some contained valuable advice. A letter he sent from Germany, accompanied by a piece of the Berlin Wall, reads, "The wall that this stone was once a part of divided Germany into two parts. Children on the east side could not go to school on the west side. Kids who lived on the west side could not have play dates with kids on the east side." He continues, "Always be happy that you live in a country where you are free to go where you want to go and visit anybody you please." One of my favorite notes is an inscription on a pocket version of the U.S. Constitution he gave me. It reads, "To Jack, this is my Bible. Love, Grand." These writings are the tip of the iceberg. The lessons he leaves with me about courage, generosity, patriotism, and love are indelible. They are a part of me now, and they will be forever. I'll close with this. Every time I'd see him, he'd ask me to sing for him one song. It's in your programs today. And the name of it was "Last Night I Had the Strangest Dream." The lyrics to the chorus were this: "Last night I had the strangest dream I'd ever dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war." In his devotion to peace and to justice, to freedom and to integrity, to compassion and to family, he's made that dream a little less strange for all of us. I love you, Grand. I will miss you. And I can't wait for the day that I can make a grandchild of mine feel the way you've made me feel.